Hello, everyone. This is Business Storytelling with Mushin-Makedonskiy again. And today we have a special guest. I welcome Jay Golden. Jay is the founder of Retellable and the author of the book, which is also called Retellable. He's a great storyteller, a storytelling coach, a trainer, and a storyteller himself. He's helped numerous companies and well, Jay will tell about us a little bit about his backstory, how he did come to it. But the first time I actually got to know Jay was while listening to the podcast by Park Howell. And honestly, that was the first time that I thought to myself, man, I just love it so much that this man has to be on my show and tell a little bit about storytelling to the Russian audience. I don't know how I'm going to do this, but to my luck, Jay is just a very nice guy, and he's here today. And he was so generous even to send me his book so I can prepare. And the book is a really a masterpiece. Guys, if you want to have a book that's under 150 pages and still packs a real punch in terms of storytelling, the Retellable is a really book to go. But okay, enough from me. Jay, thank you so much for being on the show. Welcome, and welcome aboard.
Thank you, Artem. It's an honor to be here and to be connecting with you and your audience halfway around the world. And I'm glad that you appreciated the under 150 pagedness of Retellable. It was very intentional because I have many books on my shelf that have a bookmark right around 150 pages because I got the first point and then I got tired. And so, yes, I intended for Retellable to be readable in a very short train or plane trip.
Yeah, and you know what really got me there is how do you write a book with stories about stories that is under this kind of number of pages? That's a shock for me, because I honestly thought to myself, well, the longer the book, the better the book. But this was a surprise. So, Jay, it's a pleasure to have you here. But I know quite a lot about your work and the retellable concept of yours. But can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself? Like, how did you end up doing storytelling for a profession?
Yes, thank you. When I left college, when I left university and I was 22, I was running a small business in university. It was a binoculars where you could at sporting events and concerts. And so I had these binoculars and I rented them to people to go and see these sporting events. And that was my little business in college. And when I sold that, I had one objective, and that objective was to travel the world. And so while my friends were hoping to get jobs, I wasn't afraid of a job because I was an entrepreneur already at 22, and all I wanted to do was see the world. And so I saved up that money, and I traveled, which for a time that became 1 year, then 2 years, and 3 years, and went to South America and Europe and North Africa and Asia and Australia, and learned languages and fell in love with the people of this earth, and became very connected to the places of this planet. And along the way, really learned the way of the traveler is the way of storytelling, the way of sharing these things that we've learned along the way that you might find from somebody at a street corner or a cafe. It was the traveler's commerce. And that was very precious to me. And so when I finally burned out on traveling and didn't want to sleep on the back of trucks anymore and didn't want to be away from everyone I knew, I landed in San Francisco just as the beginning of the internet was coming up in 1995. And from there, I ended up seeing that this promise of connecting with the world was coming alive all around me, and ended up taking that ride from early online learning to early music videos and web videos and um, apps, and just kind of for about 14 years, I went from startup to startup, all in content development in the early internet. And when my daughter was born, I took a pause and realized that that early promise of true connection, of shared insight, and of really valuable information sharing, um, that I had found while traveling wasn't really being delivered on the internet. I didn't see the deep storytelling and the true wisdom being shared. It was a lot about the quickest way of sharing information.
Hmm.
And so this is back in 2009. And so I kind of dropped off the technology journey and came back to more of the knowledge and said, I want to help people to connect in deep ways by honoring what they've learned in their lives and how they can truly share things that would be remembered. And so I ventured into the world of storytelling.
Hmm. Wow. I like how your journey actually contains a journey. That's that's something really both physical and philosophical in it. So
Yeah.
given that you've been working in the like the era of the rise of the internet, it's great to hear from you that stories are absent from this kind of media, were absent in in that time. And since the speeds are only well, increasing in the past times, and internet is only gaining momentum in terms of like 3 second attention span and stuff like this, we really need to talk about like this concept that you have in your book retellable, which is pitch is dead, long live the pitch. So like you don't have to cram a story, and you don't have to force it. It's really like a journey, more of a human experience. So I can feel it coming from you, and it's really a pleasure to know your story of coming to storytelling. Here's the question I would like to start off with. I know that your concept, your main goal for a story is retellable, and that was an interesting question for me when I first heard about it, because I really think that often the purpose of a story is to make an impact, well, to help someone or to persuade someone or to heal someone or to connect with someone. But impact right here and now, like the story is born in the moment between me the teller and him the listener, or vice versa. Here's the question: why did you choose retellable over like impactful? And second part of this question is actually, how can we be sure that the story is retold with the same impact like we told it the first time?
Great question. So in 2009, when I began to apply my work that I had been doing in video and in creating movies that were traveling around the world, and beginning to apply it in a human sense, I started to do research on how much information we were taking in on a daily basis. One fact really stuck with me, that we are absorbing approximately 100,000 words a day. And that is through what we hear on a news show, podcast, Zoom room, speech, book, emails, Twitter, so many words that we're absorbing. And the question kept coming back to me as I reflected on my travels all around the world and thought about all of the things that I remembered from those trips and all of the things I forgot. And the real question became, after you absorb 100,000 words, what is it that you remember tomorrow? So I'll ask you this. Yesterday, you had all kinds of things you were doing. You probably did an interview, some editing, you're doing your work, you're now not as much out in the world and traveling, but
Yeah.
what is something that you remember from tomorrow that you might even think you'll remember in a week or a month?
Hmm. That's a good question. Well, to think about it, I actually remember the moment when on the webinar I shared a story that a man told me in the one-on-one session, and we elaborated on this story, and we, they heard it for the first time, and they had their critics and had their compliments for this man and his story, and we elaborated on this one. So that's like the key moment for yesterday.
Right. So we have our moments from yesterday, right? That one probably had a little bit of tension, a little bit of stress, some excitement, something new that didn't really compete with all the other things in your brain. It just kind of rose to the top. Similarly, that's what I realized, is that while all of the people that I have been working with were kind of coming to me and my group that I had at the time to help create videos that viral videos that would travel around the world. In my last, which was the last phase of my career in the 2000s, this idea of a story that bubbles up and that survives into the next day. And why is that? What's the brain science behind it? What's the feeling behind it? What does a story carry that enables it to be retold the next day in a way that still carries the message? And so it kind of became a standard, a litmus test. A story is well told if it can be retold.
Great. So even the impact of a story today is not as important as retellability of the story, the way it is remembered. I mean, if you can remember a story a week later, it's in a way more impactful than a story that did its job like a week before and is forgotten.
Well, the impact is really is essential. It's not independent of retellability.
Yeah.
I think it's part of it, because that which goes in then stays in, right?
Yeah,
That when
to some extent. Yeah.
when someone sets something up for you and offers it to you, it has a greater chance to be retained, as opposed to information that we kind of absorb and we might say in that moment, oh yes, right, that totally makes sense. But then when we are asked to pose it again, we wouldn't remember what it was unless we wrote it down. And so this is very much a human medium. It's been a human medium since the beginning of language. And so bringing this into a personal development, a professional development, and an organizational structure was the task that I took on in 2009.
Wow, thank you. That really clarifies it for me. Jay, the second part of this question was, if we're aiming for retellable, how can we make sure that a person doesn't mess up the story when he's retelling it? Because I mean, you've probably seen it a couple hundreds, if not thousands of times, when the person is trying to do it and he fails and the story lacks its power. So is there any clues around it?
It all comes down to how you deliver your story, how you hold your essential information that you want the audience to remember, and how you set it up. So I've worked with thousands of people on telling stories, and I would say one of the most frequent challenges that I see and face is that people want to get right to the main point. Even
Mm,
if we're in the context of storytelling, they want to tell you what happened. And the challenge with that is that you're, from a brain science perspective, you're lacking a few things. You're lacking that kind of sense of tension, or as you mentioned earlier, that suspense, the dopamine that comes from the feeling of, I don't know where this is going to go.
yeah.
So when a person doesn't know where the story is going to go, but then the teller takes them on a twist and delivers an insight that surprises them, then that dopamine kind of, and that cortisol, that stress hormone, turns into something that releases oxytocin. So that kind of release feeling is almost like a simpler version of coming out of winter into spring. The
Mm,
earth is it's turning, and we're getting further away from the sun, and then we're coming back towards it again. And so it's something really essential and rooted in who we are as humans, that we love that story. Like Kurt Vonnegut says, a person gets in trouble and a person gets out of trouble. People love that story. They can't get enough of it. So while so much of our media is taking us towards information delivery and explanation, our
Yeah.
lives and what we most deeply care about and what drives us as human beings is ever more being guided by story.
That's so true. I mean, the way we all sometimes step out from the suspense to this part where, like, take me to the point. Well, and that's a smart quote from your book again. You don't need to get to the point. You need them to get the point. That's the whole difference in the
Thank you.
phrase. I love it.
I'm not
And,
sure if I said that, but I really like it.
well, it was kind of like this because I finished it a week ago, and it's still in my brain, so it's retellable. You know, Jay, stepping from this human side, I know each storyteller who is working with business has his moment when he sees or hears from a client that storytelling really helped out. And not only like, well, we've enjoyed the show, but in terms of, we have profit from it. So maybe you could tell me about one of your clients, and it will help our audience to, be more engaged about storytelling.
Yes. So part of the challenge in this work as a storytelling coach is that it's always a push and pull between the person, helping the person to see and shape their stories,
Yeah.
and enabling them and supporting them to hold their own insights and to walk the path themselves. And
Mm.
so not too long ago, I guess this was September, I was working with a client, and they were going to get up and speak in front of a large audience of a network that they had begun years before. So it was all people that they knew, and that was part of what was hard, was because this person had to get up 4 times a year and
Oh.
tell the same kind of people a different story, right?
Hmm.
Every year. So it was not like I'm bringing my keynote to Australia, or I'm going to Moscow, or I'm going to Istanbul. It was, I'm going to speak in front of the same people and direct them in a different way. So we worked very hard on this speech, but we never arrived there. We never quite got there. And we had another
Hmm.
morning. We had 2 more hours. We were going to work the next morning. And so he trusts in the process. Um, and but he went home kind of upset, frustrated that we hadn't really gotten the main point and why this really matters to the audience. And he came in the next morning and looked at me and he said, "I got it." And
Really?
basically he figured out what, and I could get into all the details. I know it's more interesting with the details, but the main point of it is that because we together worked on what the shape of a story is, and he embedded this into his practice of how to find a story, it wasn't me that found it, it was him that found it.
Hmm.
And so he came back and he said, this is what the beginning of the story is. And that was kind of a big pivot after some time of working together, where he took ownership of finding these stories himself and redirected the shape of the journey based on his own personal experience. And would then, from there on, he came to the meetings with the stories already prepared. And so how does that land with, as you said, how does that really hit the ground? I think the way that that hits the ground is once a leader begins to see the world as a module of change, see the world as a story that delivers on some essential shift, and then can match it to the thing they most care about, and they can do it themselves, then they're off and running, and they're out there telling their stories all the time in all kinds of different formats.
Wow. That's not only a case by your client, it's also a really valuable theoretical piece on how you should put ownership to your story. And it's in the form of a story. So triple thank you for this one. This is great.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I've seen this again and again. There's the first part where somebody comes to me and says, "Okay, help me tell my stories," meaning you be the coach, you figure it out, you uncover all of this. But the real work is actually offering a way of thinking and a way of discovering your life so that you can find those clear gems of wisdom and you can figure out how to apply them to your most essential insights and points in a way that really is both lasting but also meaningful for you as the speaker.
Thank you so much. That's really valuable. I hope you're writing it down, folks, listening to us right now. As I've already mentioned, I've first heard of you on Park Howell's podcast, The Business of Story. The most valuable thing for me on that podcast was that you've put out simply and clearly three essential things that you need to have to get to retellable, and those things are set up a change, anchor enough in the sensory detail, like show us the moment, show us where it was, zoom in and zoom out, and then reveal the change and link it to your audience. Three easy steps, really easy to comprehend. And that's really brilliant. But here's the catch, and here's why I would like to ask this question. For some years now, the stories are being more appreciated as a tool of communication. And basically, we are slowly but gradually moving from the world full of noise and marketing to the world that is filling up with stories. So here's the question: how can we be sure that our story is something that is remembered in the world where people are getting better at storytelling and stories?
Great question. What it makes me think of, I want to speak to the stories you already tell, because I believe there's your go-to stories, the ones you already tell. There's your reserve stories, the ones you've tried out but maybe haven't quite worked yet and you haven't quite figured out how to use them. And then there's your collection of insights and lessons, which is all the raw matter of your life, those shining moments that you remember but don't quite know what to do with. So I'll speak to the go-to part. I want to speak to the stories that you already tell.
Okay.
Right? So what I believe is that our stories are never static. The I believe that the past is a territory we can always venture into to explore and refine how our stories work and how they're delivered. And so I had a client once that came to me and said, my story has been told all over the world. It's in the New York Times, it's on NPR, it's written about in
Wow.
blogs all the time. And through her business, the story that gave birth to the business, and people just loved it. But she looked at me and she said, I am tired of telling this story. I feel like this story is cardboard now. It doesn't have any meaning to me. It's just the thing that I can tell people, and then they say, oh, wow, great. And here's the thing. If your story no longer carries meaning, if it isn't full and whole for you, then no matter how well you hit the main markers and the main points, it doesn't matter. What matters is it has to be alive for you in order to deliver it in a way that can be alive for the audience. So what I suggest in order to enliven your story is that you take a look at those go-to stories. Maybe you have 3 of them or 5 of them or 7 of them. Maybe one of them is your origin story of why you do this work. Maybe one of them is something you learned when you were young that informs who you are now. Maybe one of them is an impact story that shows how powerful your work is out in the world. Each one of those, you can go back and look at how the world was before. Choose a different angle. Travel back
Hmm.
in time and look at that moment and ask yourself again and again, why does this moment matter? What about this moment is special? What's alive in this moment? Experiment with choosing a different moment. Choose a different moment, an emblematic moment that informs the same point, but puts you a little bit on your edge, a little bit into a place that you can practice and find that life again, so that when you deliver that main point, it feels fresh and it feels new and it feels like a real gift to your audience. So it might not even be the matter of changing the words to a great degree. Maybe you choose the exact same scene, but you take the time to go back there. You take the time to consider the place of suspense, the place right before you deliver your main point, and you breathe into that a little bit, and you become a little bit more comfortable with that discomfort of the moment of change. Maybe your lesson, the thing you pull out of the story, is different than it was before. But regardless, you can go back into all of those go-to stories and transform them and breathe life back into them in a way that will further inspire your audiences.
Wow. I like that you're not talking about, be structured or, know your ending or, make a lot of repetitions. You're talking about how you should travel back to this past, to this moment, and ask yourself if it's alive and why is it so. So, and that's essential. I mean, it resonates with me in the way that some storytellers are looking at the story as as a tool, as a Lego, and some storytellers are like Doug Lippman. And what I hear from you is quite similar, that a story is actually, it's a flower, but you cannot get a flower if you put the petals together. You have to get the seed and plant the seed and wait for it to come. And in this way, this what you're telling us is return to this moment, this seed, and ask yourself. And that's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'll add to that these stories, I believe, are the treasures of your life. That this collection is truly a collection of gems. And so they're not just things that you pull out and sell. They're not just things that you use to convince someone, to persuade someone. These are the things that inform who you are, and that that person that you are is constantly emerging. So that those stories that you told 20 years ago might not have the same meaning at all.
Yeah, that's true. You have to always be, looking at the story in the way of, investigation. Great. I've been in this field for like 3-4 years now, and you've been there for quite quite some time. And I have a question, like discussion question. What has been an insight for you about storytelling? Like maybe something surprised you in this work that you're doing. Something new came to you in these years.
Yes, thank you. I had a client that came to me. He's a very successful speaker for many years, and he came to me and he wanted to revamp his stories and revitalize them.
Uh-huh.
And we were working on one particular story of when he was in his 20s. Actually, it's a story of when he was in his 20s. He was writing his first book. He was in Big Sur in the mountains, and there was a knock at the door, and a guy he opens the door at 6 in the morning, and the guy who's standing at the door is about 6'5" and says very tall, and he's got a gun in a holster on his side. The guy says, he says, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm Ken. I live here." He says, "Not anymore. You don't. This is my place. Get out." So it was the guy who owned the place, and but he was supposedly in New Zealand, but he came back that day and didn't care whether he had paid rent. He was taking back his house, and Ken was not going to argue with the 6'5" guy with the gun on his holster, and he left. And so that was a pivotal moment because it led Ken to Berkeley and to exploring a world of holistic health and aging, and it became a 40-year career for him that through which he spoke in front of 2 million people. We were working on the story, and in that story, I asked him to actually, because we're experimenting with this idea of going back into your stories, I invited him. I actually put him back in that place of being 23 again and hearing the knock at the door. And in that moment, I was thinking, well, what's going to happen next? I wasn't sure, but then I said, now it's you at 65 arriving, opening the door to and seeing in your little cabin your 23-year-old self.
Mm.
So it was this kind of time travel thing that I hadn't really experimented with. And it was just an opportunity for the 23-year-old self to recognize the 65-year-old self, and vice versa, to have a kind of, for me, it was just to kind of anchor that moment, to really bring that moment into life and realize that there are these pivotal moments in our lives that we can go back to, right? Well, what ended up happening, and I didn't know this until later, but what ended up happening was that the experience of the older Ken going and seeing the younger Ken became something that really had an impact on him. And apparently in this vision, they sat down and had a conversation. And
Oh.
this is not I have not done a lot of this. This is not my standard fare, but I do like to go back into those moments and explore them. The interesting thing for me was that, let's see, this is about 6 years later. 6 years later, we're still dear friends, and he's a client, or we call each other mentorns, part mentor, part intern.
Nice.
He talks about that moment. Of
Wow.
all of the work that we've worked over the years, the reason is because there is so much richness in exploring how we operate and how we explore the past, that that I think that it can really change things for you. So what ended up happening was the 23-year-old self looked up and said, wait, tell me about your life. And then the 65-year-old self told him about his life and his wife and his kids and all of the things that he had done. And instead of saying, you're 50 pounds heavier than you were before, the 23-year-old self just, it so appreciated the life that he was going to lead. And it kind of changed a lot of things for him.
Wow. It's a great answer because it's really resonating in so many levels. I honestly believe that not all storytelling should be business storytelling, like, influencing storytelling.
But the reason I tell you this is because the edge of this work to me is that we race so fast ahead in time to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and the past becomes prologue, and it becomes some little part of something that happened and it informed us, and then we moved on. And that's counter to my belief. My belief is that our lives are still there for us to explore and to gather insights, especially in times like these, especially in times of the innermost cave where we do not know what's going to happen next. The main question I have is, what are the insights, the stories, the lessons that you have to inform who you are at this time? And so in order to gather those, we have to take a pause. We have to go back and explore what we've learned. And we owe it to ourselves and to our friends and our clients and our families to hold ourselves in our deepest capabilities by gathering those lessons.
Wow. I haven't anticipated that a person that is working with business would dive into the healing part of storytelling. And really, I thank you. And that's something really generous. That's a generous gift that you've given us today, because the storytelling has the power to explore oneself and to help us cope with our lives and to live them more thoughtfully, and to live richer lives. And that's a beautiful example. Thank you so much. That's great.
It's nice of you to say, and I have to say that as we go forward and write our works and put together our businesses and explore the next version of what we're creating, um, sometimes the world isn't exactly ready for the things that we have in our hearts, and sometimes we have to venture out into that next area to recognize that those things aren't actually separate. While I might not speak about healing in my first business development conversation, the best clients that I have understand there's something deeper to this work, and that in fact, for example, coming out of the innermost cave, any time in the past where you've come out of a great struggle, or your clients or your audience has come out of a great struggle or a deep challenge, you don't force your way out of that. You can't force your way out of that. You have to feel your way through it. You have to gather insights from those that came before you, the mentors that you've had, the lessons you've learned in your life. It's almost like filtering through everything to figure out what you've got going forward. And I think these times are a great example of that. What do we have as people? Not everything I've already decided is true, but what can I gather together that's going to help me be more whole and more present and more relevant in this future?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And I like how you're saying that your clients, that the older clients of yours appreciate it, because that's something you have to understand. But there's no forcing of the healing part. There's only understanding, and that's beautiful. Jay, that's a lovely discussion, and I'm really getting a lot out of it. But here's the thing: we've come up to this point where my questions have run out, but I still have two, and I haven't told you about them. But I ask all my storytelling guests those two questions. So a blitz round. First one: what would be your advice for people who want to develop their storytelling skills, but they are only at the beginning of their journey?
I've been working with the idea of a storyline, which is you go back to age 0 and you create a chart. Basically, up here is good moments, down here is bad moments, and we'll call
Okay.
them bad moments, hard, challenging moments. And you start at 0 and you go to your age. All right, so for me it's 0 and 50, right? And you
Okay.
chart the moments that you recall from your life that are the good ones or the challenging ones, the meeting the girlfriend, the breaking up with the
Oh.
girlfriend, the starting the business, the having an empty refrigerator while you start the business, the meeting of the great client, the failure on stage, the lesson you learned from stage, the new business you built, right? So create a storyline. Go through and give yourself some space. Make a big couple of pieces of paper together, put it on your whiteboard, and look for those moments. Once you do that first exercise, you spend an hour doing it with a cup of coffee. Leave it, bookmark it, and come back to it in a week, and come back to it in a month. Because what happens is you will have moments that appear that become stories that you will never have had a place to put, but now you do.
Oh, that's good. That's good. So you have a map of a memories, and building this storyline actually like fuses your process of reflecting on your life. That's a great example. That's a great advice. And I love to hear that it's not about the structure. It's about this kind of, self-reflection. And it's really usable in terms of business, because you can do it with the same with your organization, like age 0 and whatever age your organization is right now. So same thing here. But
It's true.
so, and the last question, my favorite of all, I want you to finish one phrase, and the phrase goes like this: it takes one thing to get from a good story to a great story, and that one thing is.
Depth. It's a little bit like you referenced. One of the main things that people are afraid of sharing in their stories is what the actual challenge is. what the challenge was. They're afraid to show how they struggled. But it's the struggle that creates the connection with your audience. It's the difficulty, especially when you're a high level leader, when you're an innovator, that people look and they read your book and they see your videos and they see you on stage and they think, oh my gosh, that person is so amazing. But it's the depth of challenge that provides the source material for the transformation.
Mm, great. Okay, that's really insightful. Jay, thank you so much. I didn't expect to have such a warm and comfortable conversation, and especially that it's useful for business. And again, it's also reflective and deep. So thank you so much for your impact. Just to wrap it up, can you share some context of yours? How can the folks around here get their hands on your work?
Yes. So the company is Retellable. It's at retellable.com. I'm Jay at retellable.com, Jay. And you can find us, you can find me on Twitter at Golden1. You can also find the book on Amazon. And soon I will be releasing a new book, which is basically a storytelling journal that helps people to gather their lifetime of insights so they can apply them to the moment at hand.
Wow, great. I wish you all the best of luck with your work and your book. Hope it all comes out okay, and if especially in those tough times. And thank you once again for being on this show. This was great, and please stay safe.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you from my garage to yours.